Hello Flight Simmers, and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This will be Lesson 7 in our VFR or Private Pilot Level Training series. This video will be an overview of ground operations before we move on to cross-country flying. How much ground operations you do in Flight Simulator is entirely up to you. You have the option of skipping most ground operations if you want to, as you can start and stop every flight on the runway or even in the air if you want. But we'll take a look at all ground operation procedures used in real life and let you decide how much you want to include in your Flight Simulator flying. Ground operations can be divided into two broad categories: pre-departure and arrival or after landing. Operations in the pre-departure category include pre-flight planning, pre-flight inspection, engine start, departure taxi, engine run-up, and line up for takeoff. Operations after landing include taxi in, parking, engine shutdown, securing, and post-flight inspection. Some of these procedures, such as pre-flight, engine run-up, and post-flight inspection, don't really do anything practical in Flight Simulator, but we'll talk about them if you want to incorporate them into your flying for realism. The rest can be part of every normal flight if you want to start and finish at a parking space or gate. Pre-flight planning usually starts well before you get to the aircraft. Some of the pre-flight activities that pilots usually conduct are checking the weather, evaluating the route of flight, checking data on airports of intended use, and checking weight and balance data for the aircraft. Checking the weather is pretty easy if you've set the weather in Flight Simulator. If you're using live weather, you can use a website like Aviation Weather Center to look at reports and forecasts. Evaluating the route of flight and airports of intended use can be done on a site like SkyVector, which has aeronautical charts and airport facility directory information. We'll talk more about that in our lessons on VFR charts and cross-country flight planning. Let's talk in a little more detail about weight and balance. Alright, so here's the weight and balance menu for the 152 on Flight Simulator. You can also open this panel during a flight using the quick menu icon that looks like a weight, and it also opens automatically anytime you pull up to a fuel pump at an airport, or if you request a fuel truck over the radio at a towered airport. When the fuel truck arrives at your aircraft, the panel will automatically open then as well. The toggle on the top right hand side of the weight panel here toggles whether we're displaying our fuel in gallons or pounds. Pounds is good for determining weights, but most fuel burns in general aviation aircraft are done in gallons per hour. So if you want to know your endurance or how long your aircraft is going to be able to fly, you're going to want to keep it in gallons. The top slider here adjusts total fuel load on the aircraft, and it distributes it equally between the two tanks. And then you can also use the slider for each individual tank to adjust the tank load or the fuel load in each tank, or you can just go into the box and type a quantity in the box. And if you try to type something in that it can't do, let's say if I want to put 24 gallons in the tank, it'll say, well, no, you can only put 14 gallons in there because that's all it's going to hold. Payload is the amount of stuff, either people or cargo, that the aircraft can carry, including the pilot and crew. In the 152, this is the pilot and the front pax or front passenger. If you use the payload slider, if you move that up and down, that adjusts the weight equally in both seats. Or you can go down here in these boxes and you can enter individual number for each seat occupant. The maximum payload is down here at the bottom of the screen. You can see right now it shows 421 pounds. But you'll notice that if we move the fuel level up or down, that number changes. The math on that is in the rest of these numbers here, so let's talk about how that works. The left side numbers represent actual weights, and the right side maximum weights. The empty weight is the weight of the airplane with no fuel or payload aboard and is a set number that can't be changed. Well, at least not without editing files. The number at the bottom right is the max takeoff weight, or max gross weight. If you load the airplane above this limit, the aircraft will perform poorly, with increases in takeoff and landing distances, fuel burn, and decreased overall performance, particularly in the climb. If you load the airplane well beyond this limit, the airplane may not be able to climb or even get airborne. Flight Simulator will let you know you've exceeded a weight limit by turning that row red. If you subtract the empty weight from the max takeoff weight, you'll get what's called the useful load. Useful load is the total weight the aircraft can carry for both fuel and payload. In the 152, this is 589 pounds. If you load the airplane up with a full 168 pounds of fuel, you have 421 pounds of payload left. So you can get more payload on most airplanes by reducing your fuel load. This isn't something you really need to worry about too much in the 152. With 421 pounds of payload, it can carry 2 good-sized adults with a full load of fuel. But in larger aircraft, you want to fuel for the mission, meaning carry enough fuel to complete the flight and an adequate reserve in order to maximize your payload. We'll talk more about fuel planning in our lesson on cross-country navigation. On the right-hand side of this screen is our center of gravity information. The black and white circle represents the aircraft's center of gravity as it's currently loaded, and the heavy white lines represent the forward and aft CG limits. Just like the weights, if the CG is out of limits, Flight Sim will give you a red warning. If the CG is aft of the limit, the aircraft will be tail heavy and may have difficulty recovering from a stalled condition. If it's forward of the limit, it will be very nose heavy, making it difficult to both take off and land. Just ask anybody who's been trying to fly the DV-20 in Flight Sim since November. That being said, it's very difficult to get the 152 out of CG limits without it being basically empty, including fuel, or putting ridiculous weights in the payload fields. Okay, so let's set up a flight to look at the ground procedures we're going to use once we get to the airplane. Okay, so we'll set up this flight basically the same way we've set up the other flights, except that instead of setting up on the runway for a takeoff, we're going to set up at the ramp or a parking space at Pine Bluff. And what that's going to do is that when we start the flight, instead of being on the runway configured for takeoff with the engines running and everything powered up, it's going to set up the aircraft in what's called a cold and dark state, which means everything will be shut off, the engine won't be running, and it's going to be up to us to get everything powered up and running before and configured before we are ready for takeoff. So we've done our aircraft selection already. We'll go ahead and select Pine Bluff Airport, PBF. And when we do that, it brings up the second box here, gives you options for where you want to start. We have the runways just like we always have had, or you have a list of parking spaces here. About the only one that you don't want to pick is the fuel box, because that will set you up usually facing the fuel box with not enough room to turn around. So if you want to get fuel, do things realistically and go get fuel, just start up and taxi over there and then shut down and get some fuel. You can see it lists what type of spaces they are too, whether it's a aviation gate for a large heavy airplane or just a ramp parking space for a small GA airplane. Of course, in Pine Bluff, everything is GA small. You can also zoom to details, and then if you have a mouse wheel, roll in more, and it'll give you a airport diagram, and then you can pick a parking space that way as well. So we'll just go with number 9 here, I guess. And then flight conditions, this doesn't really matter today, but I would still set it up the same way we have been. So we'll pick a June day at noon with temperatures around 25 degrees C, standard pressure, no winds. Again, you can go flying if you want to, but most of this is going to be about ground ops today. So that will set us up for the flight, and we'll go ahead and click on fly and talk about the procedures we're going to use once we get to the aircraft. The pre-flight inspection, also called the walk-around, is a visual inspection of the aircraft that is made prior to engine start. The inspection is made to make sure the aircraft is airworthy and that nothing needs a mechanic's attention before you take off. The walk around typically starts in the front of the left wing, and you make your way around the aircraft in a clockwise fashion. In real life, you're looking for things like airframe or propeller damage, flat or damaged tires, and leaking fluids such as oil, fuel, or hydraulic fluid. You also usually check the fuel and oil quantity visually and check the fuel for contaminants. You can also occasionally find an animal or insect trying to make its home on board in some place that would be mutually detrimental. It's highly unlikely that you're going to find anything wrong with your aircraft in Flight Simulator, but if you want to take part in the time-honored tradition that's undertaken by new student pilots and seasoned airline veterans alike, you can always take a spin around your airplane in the drone. Just don't ask me who you're supposed to call if you find a flat tire. You can also test a few systems if you'd like before you start up. You usually want to put your flaps down for the walk around to get a better look at them in the 152. At night, it's wise to make an inspection of your aircraft lights, including the cockpit lights, before you set off. But again, it's highly unlikely that you'll find a non-functional system or burned out light bulb in Flight Simulator. But if you want to go through the motions for the sake of realism, that's up to you. Just like we did with our before takeoff and before landing checklist, we'll use a flow pattern followed by the checklist for before start and after start. And just like with those flows and checklists, we're going to tailor our own checklist for Flight Simulator, since the checklist in Flight Simulator, if they're there at all, are geared for real life or taken out of the manuals, and a lot of times they have extra stuff in there that you don't really need in Flight Simulator, or they're going to leave out some things that maybe are a little different in Flight Simulator. So let's take a look at our before start flow and checklist in the 152. So our before start flow is going to be kind of a circular pattern. We'll start at the parking brake and then work our way around back to the master switch. The reason we do that is with most of these checklists, you want the parking brake set so the aircraft doesn't start rolling on you after you crank up the engine. So the checklist is going to be parking brake, make sure that that is set, and then we'll move down to the floor to the fuel shutoff valve and make sure that that is open. That's not on the normal checklist, and the reason is that is not normally turned off during normal procedures in this aircraft. Normally you only move that valve if you have an emergency, like you have a fire on the aircraft and you need to shut off fuel so you don't worsen that condition, or the aircraft is in maintenance. So normally that is not shut off, and this caused me a lot of trouble in Flight Simulator initially when I was trying to do manual starts. And both this aircraft and the 172, Flight Simulator has the initial setup on the ramp so that that is turned off or closed, and obviously no fuel is getting to the engine, so the engine's not going to crank if it's not getting any fuel. So I would sit there and spin the starter for minutes on end, and the engine wouldn't crank, and that's because it wasn't getting any fuel. So it's kind of unusual in Flight Simulator they have that closed, so you want to make sure that is make sure and open that. Next, we want to make sure that our mixture is full rich. Then we want to turn the beacon on. In real life, that lets folks know that the engine is about to start. If they see a beacon on the ramp, they know a propeller is about to turn. We want to have the nav lights on, and that's something that I advocate, just turning them on and keeping them on. That way, anytime the master switch is on, you have the nav lights on. And then last, turn the master switch on. You want both the alternator and the battery side of that switch on. And then it is time to go ahead and crank the engine. After we get the engine started, we'll run an after start flow and checklist. This procedure makes sure that the engine is running within acceptable parameters and configures everything for taxi. So the procedure for this is going to be bring the pitot heat to on. Taxi light as you need. If you're going to start taxiing, it's good to turn that on. Personally, I'm probably going to go ahead and turn it on so I don't forget about it later. In real life, you just want to be cognizant of who's around you. If there's a ramper standing right in front of you, you don't want to blind him with your taxi light, so wait until you've turned away from him before you turn it on. Engine instruments, you want to check those and make sure that they are running in acceptable parameters. On the 152, the oil temperature is going to come off the left-hand side there, so it'll be just a little bit above the far or beyond the far left side, and then oil pressure will be just to the right of that red tick mark when it's running at idle. It won't get into the green until you actually do the run up or apply takeoff power. Want to make sure that your trim is set for takeoff. Make sure that your flaps are set as you want them for takeoff. They'll be either 0 or 10 degrees. We've been using 10 degrees for all our takeoffs in this video series, so I would just stick with that for now. So just go ahead and set your flaps to 10 degrees so you don't forget it later. We will double check that as part of the before takeoff checklist. And then finally bring the transponder to on. Older checklists will tell you can bring it to standby, but a lot of controlled airports nowadays actually have a ground radar where they can see your position on the taxiway, and they need your transponder on to be able to see you. So good standard operating procedure on that is just to bring that to on. So no matter where you are, if you're at a place like that, they'll be able to see you. Okay, so here we are set up on the ramp in Pine Bluff in the aircraft in the real world. Before you start up, you would want to take a look around the ramp to make sure that the area is clear, that you're not going to blow any debris with your prop wash into anything or anybody once you crank up. Obviously, that's not really a player in Flight Simulator, and the rampers are going to kind of do whatever they want anyway. But if you want to do the realism thing and clear the area before you start, and it's certainly not going to hurt anything. I'll also mention that in the 152 in the real world, the book says to prime the engine 3 strokes if it's been sitting more than 2 hours, particularly if it's cold outside. So if you click on the primer, which is down here underneath the parking brake here, it will pull out the primer and push it back in. And what this is doing is it's pulling a little bit of fuel vapor out, I guess, of the tank there when you pull the primer out, and it's actually shooting it into the cylinders when it goes back in. And what that does is as you turn the engine over, there's actually a little bit of fuel in the cylinders rather than it having to push it through the carburetor. So when that spark plug fires, it should light right off and crank right up even in cold weather. There's nothing wrong with priming it in Flight Simulator, but I've started it several times and it doesn't seem to really matter whether you prime it or not. It starts right up regardless. All right, so the area is clear and we're ready to go ahead and start up the engine. We'll do our before start checklist. The parking brake is on, and go down to between the seats here. Make sure the fuel shutoff valve is open. Mixture comes to full rich. Beacon comes on. Nav light comes on, and the master switch comes on. And the way we want to start the engine is to bring the ignition switch to both, and then we'll click and hold the starter in the start position until the engine actually cranks up. And once it cranks up, you can let go and move into your after start procedures. So I'll go ahead and click and hold it and start. And the engine starts right on up. So we'll go into our after start flow. So the pitot heat is coming on. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the taxi light on so I don't forget about it later. The engine gauges look to be in the green. The oil pressures come up off the stop, or excuse me, oil temperature. The oil pressure is also off the 0. That's normal indications for this airplane. The trim is set for takeoff. The transponder will move to on, and I'm going to go ahead and set up for a flaps 10 takeoff. So I will bring my flaps to 10 degrees, and then I'll run my after takeoff checklist. Excuse me, my after start checklist. And the after start checklist is complete, and so we are ready to taxi. Before you start taxiing, another thing that's a good procedure to do is to go ahead and set up your comm and nav radios like you want them. If you're going to dial in a nav radio and have a radial set up, if you're going to do some VFR navigation, it's a good idea to set that up before you start moving. This is what we call kind of a low workload environment here. Once you get on the taxiway, you're starting to get in a high workload environment where somebody might be behind you, they want to get off, and you might be tempted to rush things. So it's better to get things done while you're standing still rather than to try to do them on the move for the most part in an airplane. Unfortunately, Flight Sim always seems to spawn ramp personnel right next to your aircraft when you start in a parking space. So do your best to avoid them when you do the taxi out, but if you can't, they are visual objects and not physical ones, just like the taxi lights. So you're not going to damage the aircraft or cause the simulator to give you a black screen and say you've done damage to your aircraft if you accidentally taxi over them. They do seem to be impervious to propeller blades and aircraft parts. So again, try to avoid them if you can, if you want to be realistic, but you know, if they didn't want to get run over, they probably shouldn't have parked that close to the aircraft. To start taxiing, you're going to need a little more thrust to get the aircraft going than to keep it moving. This is called breakaway thrust. So you want to bring the throttle up to about 1,000 RPM in the 152, and it might take a second or two before it starts rolling. And then once it starts moving, then you can bring it back to idle. And idle throttle should be enough to keep you going unless you're taxiing on a pretty good incline. In the real world, it's also good practice once you get underway to give your brakes a quick test. Just tap them once to make sure that they're working properly, and that can also tell you in Flight Simulator if you don't have the brakes set up, brake control set up correctly. You also want to allow the aircraft to move forward a few feet before you attempt to turn. So you want to go straight for just a couple feet before you start the turn. If you start that turn before you start moving forward, the friction on the nose wheel from being a little sideways is going to make it more difficult to start moving forward, and generally it's actually going to increase the radius of turn because you're going to need extra power and probably get a little extra speed, and you may end up having to go straight before you can go in a turn. So just let it move forward a couple feet before you start the turn. To steer the airplane, you're going to use your nose wheel steering, which is connected to your rudder pedals in most light GA airplanes. So you're going to want to steer with whatever you have set up in Flight Simulator to control your rudders or your yaw control on the ground. All right, so we are ready to get underway. I'll go ahead and release the parking brake. And the best camera, I think, for taxiing is probably that default camera one that we set up in the first lesson, where it cuts off the view right below the instrument panel. That gives you the best visibility for taxi. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my throttle up to about 1,000 RPM. The aircraft starts to move. I'll go ahead and try to make a hard turn to avoid that ramp personnel over there. And it's taxiing at a pretty good speed, so I'll go ahead and bring the throttle back to idle, and I'm steering with my rudder pedals here. And then I'll just taxi right over to this taxi line. And what I want to do is try to put the nose wheel on that taxi line. And again, the taxi lights here are visual objects and not physical objects. You can try to taxi around them if you want, but if you want to stay on the taxiway center line, they're not going to hurt the aircraft or damage the aircraft or end your simulator session if you just taxi right over them. Most of the taxiways in Flight Simulator seem to be a little rough. We do seem to get this kind of three-wheel motion going. If you get going more than about, 3 or 4 miles an hour, you get the nose bob here. To stop that, just kind of tap on your brakes a little bit, get the airplane slowed down, and it gets a little better, but still not great. Once you leave the ramp area, you want to try to keep your nose wheel on the yellow taxiway center line. Doing so provides obstacle clearance for your wings at most airports. Also be aware that most GA aircraft don't turn as well as their real-life counterparts, so make sure to give yourself a wide berth and or slow speed for sharp turns. As far as taxi speed goes, the FAA says in its flight training manual that you shouldn't taxi faster than a brisk walk, which would probably be about 4 or 5 miles an hour, about 3 or 4 knots. That's fine for small airfields with shorter runways, but at large airfields you could take half a day getting to the runway if it's far away if you're going that speed. The bottom line is that you don't want to get so fast that you're having trouble stopping or making a turn, and you don't want to generate lift as you taxi. So in small aircraft you probably shouldn't exceed 10 or 15 knots during taxi. Of course, the problem in the 152 is that there is nothing in the airplane that tells you how fast you're going on the ground. When you get into aircraft that are equipped with GPS units, you can use the ground speed readout on those to determine what your taxi speed is. But in the 152, you just have to make a guess. But a good rule of thumb is that if you feel like you're going too fast, you probably are, and you need to slow down. So the appropriate technique in the real world, if you want to slow down, is to bring the engine to idle and try to let the aircraft slow down that way. And then if the aircraft is still accelerating or not slowing the way you want to, then you use the brakes. You try to go sparingly on the brakes in real life, because if you use them excessively or ride on them, you're going to cause them to heat up and wear out, and they'll have to be replaced more often, which either you or the aircraft owner is going to have to pay for. Luckily, that's not a factor in Flight Simulator because the idle speeds seem to run a little higher than they should, and you're probably going to find yourself stepping on the brakes, every 5 to 10 seconds to keep it at a reasonable taxi speed. So that is just kind of a simism, and that is not anything that you're doing wrong, but just don't try to let that translate to a real aircraft if you ever go take flight lessons in the real world, because that will wear out the brakes. Okay, so as we get to the end of the taxiway here, we want to think about positioning ourselves for our run-up. Ideally, in the real world, you want to point the aircraft into the wind, which is going to mean usually facing more or less the same direction that the runway is facing. So like here in Pine Bluff, I'd probably want to kind of make a wide rollout here to the left, kind of to the edge of the taxiway, and then position the aircraft so it's pointed kind of south. I'm not going to do that today because I've got a calm wind set, so it's fine just to point the aircraft at the runway. You also want to be aware if there's somebody behind you, you might want to kind of point your tail towards the grass so you're not blowing prop wash at them. As you can see, as we get close to the runway here, we get the stripes here on the center line to tell us that we're getting close to the runway, and then the hold position signs and the hold position markings. You want to hold short of those markings so that you can clearly see them from the cockpit, and you don't want any part of your aircraft extending past those hold short markings. And again, you need to be taking the runway for takeoff, basically, or back taxi if you're going to cross the lines at a non-towered airport. And if you're at a towered airport and you're using ATC, you want permission from tower before you move past those markings. So we'll go ahead and set our parking brake and move on to the run-up. In real life, once you get short of the runway, you want to perform an engine run-up. This is to test the engine for things like a bag magneto or a fouled spark plug. Just like the pre-flight inspection, you're unlikely to find anything wrong with the aircraft during this procedure in the sim. And in real life, if you did find a problem, it most likely means you're going to have to taxi back to the ramp to talk to a mechanic and get things sorted out. But we'll step through the procedure and show you how to do it, and then if you'd like to include it in your flight simulator flying, you can do that. When you park to do the run-up, you want to try to orient yourself into the wind as much as possible if the taxiway is wide enough as you're holding short of the runway. Sometimes the taxiway is not wide enough. It's also a good idea to point your nose out towards the grass instead of back towards the taxiway in case somebody taxis up behind you while you're doing your run-up. Sometimes you just don't have enough room out there, but if you've got the room, it's a good idea to try to do that. Just make sure and give yourself plenty of room to make the turn to get back turned towards the runway when it's time to take the runway for takeoff without getting into the grass. And some airports actually have little concrete run-up pads, run-up areas close to the end of the runway that you can use to pull into and do a run-up. Generally, piston engine aircraft have to do a run-up, and generally speaking, jet aircraft do not. They have enough warning systems to let them know if there's a problem that they don't have to do a run-up. So a lot of airports have areas where you can get out of the way of the jet aircraft while you're doing your run-up in your piston engine airplane. All right, so let's talk through the engine run-up procedure real quick before we actually demonstrate it. So before we do anything, we want to set the parking brake, and this lets us not have to worry about holding on to the toe brakes or worrying about the aircraft rolling off while we have the engine power up. Then we'll do a flight control check as part of the run-up check, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we do the demo. We'll check and set our flight instruments. Particularly, you want to set the directional gyro to the correct heading or the heading indicator, and make sure that your altimeter is set correctly. We also want to set the comm and nav radios if we're going to use them, and if we didn't set those up already before we left the ramp. Then we'll get into the actual engine run-up procedure. So we'll increase the throttle to 1700 RPMs. When we do this, we're going to check our engine instruments because they won't read correctly while they're at idle, so they should be reading correctly now. So we'll check the suction gauge and make sure that that's in the green now. And the other one is the oil pressure gauge. Make sure that the oil pressure has come up into the green as well. We can also look over and check the amp meter. That is actually working more or less correctly in Flight Simulator now, so we should make sure that that's got a positive charge, that we're charging our battery. Then we'll get into the magneto check, and what we're doing is we're turning the ignition to a single magneto, either the left or right magneto, and making sure that all the spark plugs are working correctly and that each magneto is working correctly. And when we drop it to a single magneto, we'll get an RPM drop. So what we'll do is we'll move it to the single magneto. We'll see a drop. We should see no more than 125 RPM drop. And then when we compare the two, left and right, we should see no more than 50 RPM difference between the two. After that, we'll bring the magnetos back to both, and we'll do a carb heat check. We know the carb heat is working if when we pull it on, the RPM drops. So we'll pull it on, see the drop, and then leave it out. And the next thing we'll do is an idle carb heat check. Sometimes the idle is set low enough that if you bring the carb heat on, it will actually cause the engine to lose power if the idle is set too low. So we'll reduce the throttle to idle with the carb heat on and make sure the engine still runs, and then we can push the carb heat off. And the last thing we do is we do a magneto ground check, and this is just to make sure the magnetos are grounded correctly and that they will turn off when we switch them to off. So we'll bring the magneto switch momentarily to off, see that the engine starts to lose power, and then switch it back to the single magneto and then back to both again. Okay, so let's take a look at how this actually works when we're performing it short of the runway here. Alright, so we'll go ahead and start our run-up procedure here. The parking brake is set, and we're going to do a check of the flight controls. And the rule here is thumbs up, ailerons up. So if I bring the yoke or the stick to the left, we'll see that that aileron goes up, and then on the other side the aileron comes down. And if I move the stick to the right, the opposite happens. That aileron goes up and that aileron comes down over there. And we can also do the quick view behind us and check the elevator. When we pull back, the elevator should say hello to us, pop up, and then when we push forward, the elevator should go down, which we can see kind of on the right side of the empennage there. You can see the edge of the elevator there. And so that's a good control check. Another thing that you can do is called a box check, which is basically if you have a joystick, you take it through the 4 points of a box. So you do forward and left, and then forward and right, and then back and right, and then back and left, and then bring it back to the middle and neutralize it. And just take a look at your ailerons in your elevator when you're doing that, and make sure that the controls are going in the right direction. Again, Flight Simulator, you're not likely to find anything wrong, but in the real world, there have been instances where mechanics have rigged controls incorrectly, and it would have made for a very eventful flight if the pilots hadn't caught it on the control check. The next thing that we want to do is check that our instruments are set correctly, and this is mostly the directional gyro and the altimeter. Altimeter is set to 2992, and the directional gyro, we can just push the D key and that lines it up. Just want to make sure it's lined up with the magnetic compass heading there. After we do that, double check that your common nav radios are set like you want them. Obviously that's going to be a bigger player when we actually get into using ATC and using VOR radios, which we haven't really talked about yet, but that's a good time to check those. Then we're going to do the actual engine run up, so we'll bring the throttle up to 1700 RPMs, again making sure that your parking brake is set. And the first thing that we do is first thing we're going to do is check that our engine gauges and suction gauges look okay. So you see the suction gauge has come into the green there, and the engine instruments, we've got good oil temperature, and the oil pressure has now come into the green. So that's good. We'll look over here at our amp meter, and that's showing a positive charge. That has been fixed so it works more correctly in Flight Simulator now, by the way. So we are actually showing a positive charge now instead of negative charge. Then we'll do a magneto check, and what you want to do here is you want to go from both to a single magneto, so we'll go from both to left and watch our RPMs. And we can see it gets just a little bit of a drop, and that's what we want. And then we'll go from left back to both. So just one click over, and the RPMs come up just a little bit. And then we come back to right. So it's be 2 clicks to the right magneto. And again, we see a little bit of a drop there, and then click it back over to both. And that's just checking that all of our spark plugs are working okay, and that we don't have a fouled plug. Fouled spark plug or a bad magneto. Let's see, after that we'll move to the carb heat check just to make sure the carb heat is working. So we pull the carb heat out, we see a little drop in the RPM, and that tells us the carburetor heat is indeed working. Then we're going to do an idle check with the carb heat, so we'll pull the throttle all the way back to idle with the carb heat on, and the idle RPM will be a little bit lower now. And what we're doing is sometimes they rig this so the RPM is too low, and the engine will actually try to quit on you a little bit if you bring it all the way back to idle with the carb heat on. And if it does that, obviously it needs to be recalibrated. So with it at idle and the carb heat on, the engine still runs, so we're good there. Now we're going to do what's called a grounding check, and that's to make sure that all the magneto wires are hooked up correctly. If they're not, you can actually have the magnetos being live even though you've turned the ignition switch off, and if you rotate the propeller, the magneto can fire and cause the propeller to spin and injure people. So we'll go over to the right magneto, so 2 clicks to the right, and then we'll drop it quickly to off and then back to right. And what we want to see is that the engine starts to quit on us once we take away the magnetos, and then we'll quickly put it back to right before it has a chance to shut all the way down. So over to off, starts to slow down, back to right, and then we'll put it back to both. And that is the run up. After you finish the run up, you'll want to run through your before takeoff checklist, and then you are ready to go flying. All right, so we'll run through a quick before takeoff checklist, and then we will taxi out onto the runway and initiate our takeoff. If you're at an airport where runway length is not a factor and the weather is decent, you can do a rolling takeoff, meaning that you do not have to stop when you taxi out onto the runway. You can just roll out on the runway at a reasonable speed, and then once you're lined up, just go ahead and apply the throttles. So we'll go through our before takeoff check here real quick. So the parking brake is released, the lights are on, elevator trim is for takeoff, set for takeoff, carburetor heat is cold, mixture is full rich, flaps are set to 10 degrees, and the transponder is on alt. And so we are ready to go. So we'll again apply just about 1,000 RPMs to get the airplane moving here. And then we'll follow the taxiway center line onto the runway. If you just keep your nose wheel on that line, then that will steer you right out onto the center line of the runway. So just follow that line there. Normally it goes out to the center at most runways, but just kind of aim for the center of the white stripes there. And then once you are out on the runway and lined up with the center line, then you go ahead and just bring in your takeoff power, and off you go. If you're someplace that runway length is minimal, or there are obstacles, or maybe even if the runway is a decent length, and but the conditions are not great, maybe you've got a contaminated runway with some slush or something on it, you want to do a standing takeoff, which is just where you taxi out onto the runway, line up with the center line, and then come to a full stop, and then initiate your takeoff roll from there. And if you're actually doing a short field takeoff, which we'll get into later, then you actually will want to hold the brakes while you bring the power in before you start your takeoff roll. So just roll out on the runway, bring it to a full stop, and then once you're at a full stop, you can go ahead and initiate your takeoff. At some smaller airports, the taxiway may not extend to the end of the runway, or there may not be any taxiways. In this case, you'll need to back taxi or taxi on the runway in the opposite direction that you're going to take off and turn around at the end. When you have to do this, make sure to taxi on one side of the runway towards the end to give yourself plenty of room to make the turnaround at the end without going in the grass. Some runways do have turnaround areas at the end of the runway, which is a little wider area of pavement at the end of the runway to help facilitate doing a turnaround after a back taxi. After you land, when you're looking for parking spaces, you can check an airport diagram if the airport has one, and that will show you where the general aviation parking areas are. And you can also use the airport map in the flight simulator flight planner. It shows where all of the parking spaces are, and if you hover over the space, it will tell you what parking ramp number it is. Or if it has a gate, that means that it has an airline terminal gate. And then there's also a pull-down list here, which will tell you where the spot designation, and then it'll tell you what it's for, if it's a ramp and what size aircraft it will take. And generally, GA small means light general aviation, whereas a GA large is probably going to be, a corporate jet or something like that. And then the gates for the terminals, gate small generally means narrow body. I think they have a medium, which is probably like something like a 757 or 787. I think then they also have a large or heavy, which is for like a 747. The marshaller will use signals to guide you into the parking space. They will indicate where you should park by raising both arms straight in the air. You should orient your aircraft straight ahead with the nose pointed at the marshaller. Once you line up with the marshaller, they will motion you straight ahead by motioning with both arms. If the marshaller needs you to turn, they will indicate the direction of the turn by holding their arm straight in the direction they want you to turn your nose while motioning with the other hand. As you approach the parking spot, they will raise their arms over their head and bring them together to indicate the approximate distance from the spot they want you to stop at. When they bring their arms together forming an X, this means to stop. Once we get parked in the parking space, then we'll go ahead and use a shutdown flow and a shutdown checklist to shut down the engine and get the airplane depowered. And we are going to have to make our own checklist on this one because Flight Simulator does not have a checklist for shutting down on the 152. And the flow on this is going to be, we're going to set the parking brake first, and then we're going to make a sweep from right to left to power down some electrical things, and then we'll make another sweep from right to left to shut down the engine and completely depower the airplane. So our shutdown flow is going to be, first set the parking brake, then we'll turn our transponder to standby, then we'll turn the taxi light off if we didn't turn that off as we turn in the parking space so as not to blind the simulated ramper. Then we'll turn the pitot heat off, so that's all of our electrical stuff that needs to come off before we shut the engine down. Then we'll pull the mixture control all the way back to cut off, so pull it all the way aft, and that is what will shut the engine down. And then we'll turn the beacon off, then turn the ignition or the magnetos to off, and then turn the master off. All right, once we're set up in the parking space, we're going to want to go ahead and do our shutdown flow and shutdown checklist. One note is that I believe it's when you turn the master switch off, it pops up a menu on Flight Simulator asking if you want to go back to the main menu. I think it gives you an option to go to the logbook or profile or something like that, or to continue. So if you want to keep going and do more post-flight stuff, or if you want to crank back up and go flying again, just hit continue and you'll just be right where you were. It won't exit or anything. So just be aware of that. Okay, so for our shutdown flow, the parking brake is set. We'll bring the transponder to standby. We'll bring the taxi light off. The pitot heat also comes off. And then we'll do basically the shutdown stuff. So we will shut down the engine by pulling the mixture all the way to cutoff, the full aft position there. That will shut down our engine. We'll wait for the propeller to stop, and once we do that, it's just straight across to shut everything else off. So the beacon comes off, the mags come off, and the master switch comes off. And that is our shutdown checklist complete. And let's talk a little bit about securing the aircraft. In real life, once you've shut down, you usually secure the aircraft by either chalking it or tying it down on the ramp or putting it in a hangar. You'd also want to do a post-flight inspection on the aircraft. After you finish with the post-flight inspection, you'd want to report any maintenance discrepancies, in other words, anything that broke, to a mechanic so that they can be addressed before the next flight. This makes sure that the aircraft is ready for the next flight or the next pilot. That finishes out our lesson on ground operations. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what ground procedures you want to incorporate into your personal flying in Flight Simulator. Next lesson, we'll take a look at cross-country flying. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.